Welcome, everyone. I'm Kevin Anderson, the coordinator for the Austin Water Center for Environmental Research, and this is our lunchtime lecture series for 2020. We're focused on Alexander von Humboldt's Science and the Geography of Nature. Humboldt was an amazing figure in the 19th century, and he lived a long life spanning the 18th to the 19th century, and had a huge influence both on American science, but globally with his writings and his vision. For the Americas, Humboldt is most notable for this journey he made, one of the most rigorous scientific journeys exploring the Americas from 1799 to 1804. He traveled into the Amazonian basin, down the Andes, climbed what was then considered the tallest mountain in the world, Chimborazo. He journeyed north to Mexico, New Spain as it was then, and spent a year there. He then journeyed back to Cuba, and then north to meet President Jefferson and the intellectuals of the United States before returning to Paris, where he would spend many years producing a series of incredibly important books, from his personal narrative of that journey through Views of Nature, Essay on the Geography of Plants, a book on the indigenous peoples of the Americas, and then most significantly, his final great 5-volume opus, Cosmos. And Cosmos was the scientific bestseller of the age. In 1845, the first edition of the very first volume of Cosmos sold out in 2 months, and by 1851, Humboldt estimated 80,000 copies had been shipped. He himself superintended the French translation, and by 1846, it had also been translated into English, Dutch, and Italian. His publisher wrote in 1847 that the demand for the second volume was epoch-making. Behind that book was a vision of nature, and Humboldt's vision of cosmos was particularly important and now relevant to us today. It was Humboldt who recovered the Greek term cosmos to apply to the universe. Cosmos means the universe is a complex and orderly system or entity, and for the Greeks, it was the opposite of chaos. And he coined the modern term cosmos for this final work because he wanted this work to signify both the order of the world and the adornment of that universal order. For the key to Humboldt's use of the ancient Greek word cosmos was its double references to the physical universe as it exists apart from humanity, and to the beauty and order of that universe, which are ideas intrinsic to humanity. In short, the universe exists without us, but it exists as a cosmos only through our minds. Humans are part of nature, and that was the key component of Humboldt's view of nature. And our belonging to nature was both our perception of it as beautiful and orderly, but also our role in nature. So cosmos for Humboldt meant order, which refers to observed fact that the physical universe, independently of humans, demonstrates regularities and patterns that we can define as laws. And adornment, which refers to human imaginative perception of beauty and wonder. And that's also part of the universe and part of Humboldt's science. So with looking at Alexander von Humboldt, we recognize that with Humboldt, there was a kind of invention of our contemporary notion of nature. And now what's occurring is a rediscovery of Humboldt's idea of nature. And that idea was an ordered unity, a globally complex system of interconnections, a cosmos open to imagination and wonder, a subject for exacting scientific study, and an object of human mismanagement. All of this is now a familiar concept, but much of it was new with Humboldt. Strangely, after the 19th century in the United States, Humboldt was forgotten. and is only being rediscovered now by environmental scientists and others. One of the things we'll try to answer in our lectures this year is why that happened. The rediscovery of Humboldtian science, then, is this significant recognition that the components of his vision of science are relevant today. The key components of that vision was, one, go out, explore. Nature speaks and the scientist must go out and listen. And when you do that, you go out and you collect, you gather data for or against an idea or theory, you measure, and that measurement needs to be widespread, accurate, and collaborative. You then connect that data into patterns that point to underlying laws. For Humboldt, then, this requires international collaboration because he wants this done on a global scale. And that requires then cosmopolitan science, science that doesn't stop at national boundaries. And science then, as an international collaboration, is a kind of nation building, a fraternity of people participating in this process. And the process is the accurate measured study of widespread but interconnected real phenomena in order to find a definite law and a dynamic cause. All of that we're going to explore in the lectures this year, beginning with Western culture and the study of nature, moving into Humboldt and the science of nature, and ending with Humboldt and the geography of nature as it applies to us today. The vision that he brought to the globe is a geography of nature of order and change, of structure and dynamic change. Nothing stays the same, it's all in motion, but all of it has a regularity that can be detailed. Most famously in Humboldt's isothermal chart for the globe, these regions of climate and temperature that shape habitats on Earth. And all of that has a background. And what we've been doing with the first two lectures that I've done, and now with the third, is unpacking the background to Humboldt, setting the stage for him to emerge in his life in the late 18th century into the 19th century. We've looked at natural philosophy and natural history. We're now going to look at ecological imperialism and the geography of nature, which is a second component to natural history as it led up to Humboldt. Ecological imperialism and the geography of nature, our March lunchtime lecture. Let's begin. So far we've seen natural history as a parallel study to natural philosophy looks at the world qualitatively, observing it and describing it. We saw that for the Romans and in medieval times, there were these bestiaries and herbals, these encyclopedias of nature, old and new, looking at animals and plants. We saw too in the last lecture that this led to a greater and greater realism in depicting nature, from fantastical beasts to accurate depictions of rabbits and plants like chiles brought new from the Americas. And so artists as naturalists took a central role in this new natural history, especially in the Renaissance and going forward. And in going forward, this leads to the scientific revolution and the creation of a scientific taxonomy for sorting out plants and animals. What we'll look at in this lecture then is a continuation of that collecting and the emergence of these artists as naturalists, and then the particular role of this collecting and artistic depiction of nature through the travels of scientists, as we would call them today. And these scientific travelers emerge as well before Humboldt. And of course, Humboldt in many ways is the apex of those scientific travelers. Always looking at order and change. And we'll see how that plays out too. Before Humboldt, there was this great age of discovery. And that age of discovery was led by scientific travelers, traveling the globe with the discoverers themselves, like Columbus and Magellan. These scientific travelers focused on collecting data, collecting animals and plants, bringing them back to Europe to understand them. And of course, parallel to all that discovery was European imperial conquest of the globe. And that meant European colonial expansion. So as those journeys of discoveries traced new pathways across the oceans, it also traced pathways for the expansion of European power. So scientific travel and discovery paralleled a kind of new global geography of nature that was overlaid with European colonial expansion. And when we reach Humboldt, Humboldt is the most famous of scientific travelers. His role in our story also points forward, because beyond Humboldt were those that he inspired to travel, and none was more important than Charles Darwin, who as a young man read the personal narratives of Humboldt. And in this picture you see the multi-volume edition of Humboldt's personal narratives that Darwin took on him on his own voyage, that he then wrote up as a personal narrative, The Voyage of the Beagle. The link between these two men shapes all biological science beyond the 19th century to today. And it was Darwin's epitaph for his hero that was written in a letter to his friend Joseph Hooker in 1881, the year before Darwin's own death. In that letter, he says, "I believe that you are fully right in calling Humboldt the greatest scientific traveler who ever lived. You might truly call him the parent of a progeny of scientific travelers who, taken together, have done much for science." And of course, Humboldt is superseded as the greatest scientific traveler by Charles Darwin. Because Humboldt was also a product of previous scientific travelers whose travel and collecting had all kinds of unintended consequences that we'll look at in this lecture today. So Humboldt's geography of nature, a nature of order and change, is what will culminate through the journeys that come before Humboldt. And that scientific traveling was wrapped up in a collecting impulse. And then that collecting impulse required a putting in order of all those things that were collected. And as we talked about last month and pointed to the book by Brian Ogilvie, The Science of Describing, in that book, Ogilvie also points to the collecting impulse, the desire to possess as many and as varied things as possible, in particular to its pursuit in gardens, herbaria, and cabinets. This drove natural history along a path towards less immediate experience of nature in situ, to the more formal delight at perceiving and putting in order similarities and differences between hundreds and thousands of individual species. The search for a formally elaborate system in nature, one that would go beyond tacit perceptions of relationships, well, that has its origins in this pursuit of collecting. And Ogilvie pointed to this emerging community of naturalists that did this. And this emerging community through the Renaissance led to the scientific revolution. And at the core of that group was the first of those communities, the Academy of Lyncéens, 1603 to 1630. Their amazing work detailed in David Friedberg's wonderful book, The Eye of the Lynx. At the core of that was this impulse to collect that Prince Federico Sisi spearheaded with his scientific community, the Lyncéens, this huge collection and the detailed accounting that was brought together there. That collecting impulse was driven by curiosity and wonder. And from the 1500 to 1700, there was this amazing expansion of these collections in Cabinets of Curiosity. A great book about those is out there. And then, of course, those cabinets led to what we understand to be museums. These cabinets themselves, the term from German really means rooms at the beginning, where these museum type rooms were filled with the collections from floor to ceiling, even onto the ceilings. The earliest pictorial record of a natural history room is this engraving in the book Histoire Naturelle, published in 1599. These rooms later became called Kunstkammers or Wunderkammers, these art rooms, these wonder rooms. They took many forms, the most famous of which was Ole Wurm's great museum of curiosities. Wurm lived from 1588 to 1654. And you can see that the room itself was packed full of these objects, everything from human-made objects to natural objects thrown together and then put in some kind of order that forced an understanding of what was the appropriate order. Is it geography, or is there some deeper underlying order to these objects? And the depictions of these rooms in paintings themselves led to a broader understanding and interest in Wunderkammer. Here, this painting from 1636 gives a glimpse into one corner of that room, and you can see the combination of paintings themselves with these natural objects and human objects. And then it becomes even more refined into these almost portable pieces of furniture, Kunstschranken, that are called art boxes, literal cabinets of curiosity that are curiosities themselves because they open with multi-layered drawers and panels into greater collections that are both on the surfaces and then within the drawers themselves. The most famous of these was produced by an Augsburg merchant, diplomat, and collector, Philipp Hannohofer, and one of his great works was captured and then returned home to King Gustavus's castle in Uppsala, which is now the Museum Gustavianum in Uppsala, where you can still today, and I've gone and visited, see this cabinet and see the collection that's inside of it. And what all of this means is that a geography of nature was being created through this time of discovery and exploring, and then there was a growing market for those natural artifacts and visual art from all the new worlds that were being discovered through that exploration. That process of scientific traveling and collecting created this market for natural artifacts and then natural history books that led to writings and accounts and paintings and all of the process that led up to Humboldt himself in 1799 heading out on his journey. I want to talk about a few significant figures. There are far too many to give a full account in one lecture, but some key ones that were influences on Humboldt and significant in their own right as pioneers in their work. One of my favorite and one of the most important for rediscovery is Maria Sibylla Merian. And Merian is significant, one, for being a woman in this male-dominated world. Two, being one of the first to focus in on insects, and not just the insects themselves, but the plants and their whole life cycles that they're bound up with together. These were ecological books that she produced, the first of which the caterpillar's marvelous transformation and strange floral food, focused on European species and their relationship to plants, and then most significant, it debunked the idea that insects came to life through spontaneous generation, which was widely accepted in her lifetime, in which her work and her artwork and her science showed was not accurate. And you can see in these depictions of the life cycle of a moth bound to raspberries, the eggs are shown there, the early instars, and then the moth itself emerging from the chrysalis, all tied to the plant itself. So the full life stages of the insect, and then Marion described the life cycles of 186 different insect species in this marvelous book. But her most famous work was based upon her too being a scientific traveler, because she most famously and infamously divorces her husband, sets up her own career as a publisher, an artist, and as a scientist. She takes her daughter and travels to Suriname, where she spends 2 years collecting, trading for insects, spiders, crocodiles, turtles, brings all of that back to Holland, and creates this marvelous work, The Insects of Suriname. In 1705, she publishes it. She's her own publisher, so this is how she makes her living. And then the artwork and the ecology depicted in these drawings and paintings set the stage for a new understanding of tropical America. And this understanding ranged from the first depiction of a spider predating a bird. Here you can see a tarantula capturing a hummingbird. The relationship in those plants of ants with the spiders, with the birds, and then doing it all in this glorious artwork depicting relationships and ecology. And it was Goethe who was a huge influence on Humboldt and a friend of Humboldt. Goethe praised Marion for her ability to move between art and science, between nature observation and artistic intention, between order and adornment, as Humboldt will depict it. For Humboldt, just like Marion, saw no separation between art and science. They worked together to reveal an underlying order of the world. Now, in contrast to Marion, another huge influence on Humboldt and a true scientific traveler who collected, measured, and connected, William Dampier, the first person to circumnavigate the world 3 times, and famously doing that not as a scientist alone, but as a travel writer and as a pirate. His first voyage around the world was literally as a pirate. He joined up with buccaneers and roamed the Americas, crossed the Isthmus of Panama, and then headed home from east to west. And all of that adventure culminated in the first English best-selling travel book, A New Voyage Round the World, 1697. This book made him famous in Europe and allowed him to do his second voyage, which was an official voyage of discovery funded by the British Admiralty. He was captain on board the HMS Roebuck. The Roebuck itself eventually sank in Australia, but he made it back to the Americas, where he was able to get the money to do his third voyage. And here he was, the first Englishman to reach and map parts of Australia that he found in his second voyage in the Roebuck. And he detailed all of that in a further account of his journeys around the world. And in those writings, we get the first introduction into English of words like avocado, barbecue, important to Texans, breadfruit, cashews, catamaran, chopsticks. All of this goes back to Dampier. A wonderful biography by the Prestons, A Pirate of Exquisite Mind, is available, as well as the account of the new voyage around the world that Dampier himself published. In terms of science and influence on Humboldt, though, this was a man of exquisite mind and of careful observation and description. The second book that he wrote, New Voyage and Voyages and Descriptions, contained a significant technical work, a discourse of trade winds, breezes, storms, tides, and currents through the torrid zone throughout the world. This piece, this essay within his other books, really set the stage for him to be the first scientific traveler to connect winds and surface currents and produce the first wind map of the world. Dampier pointed out, "'Tis generally observed by seamen that in all places where trade winds blow, the current is influenced by them and moves the same way with the winds. So wind and ocean are bound together through his observations." A very Humboldtian figure, and one who will influence Humboldt himself. Because that global system that Dampier recognized, an ordered unity, a globally complex system of interconnections, allows navigators to travel the Atlantic and the Pacific, assured that current will follow wind and take them there and back again. So Dampier was this Humboldtian scientific traveler, an explorer who collected, measured, connected. He was the first naturalist to visit all 5 continents, the first naturalist of Australia, or New Holland as it was called then, the first Englishman to stop in the Galapagos, the first to use the term subspecies to talk about species both in South America and the Galapagos. The first to describe zebras, marijuana, breadfruit, avocados. The first to identify cochineal as an insect, not a seed, cochineal being the insect on prickly pear cactus that the Spanish shipped back to Europe for that purple dye that comes from cochineal. All this is reason to go read Pirate of Exquisite Mind and learn more about this character. But you can see what an inspiration he was for someone like Humboldt. Humboldt wanted to do this journeying too. But it wasn't Dampier alone. It was more established figures. The great collector that set the stage for all collecting in England was Hans Sloane, who had been appointed physician to the governor of Jamaica in 1687. He spends 15 months in Jamaica collecting and exploring. He comes back and writes a natural history of Jamaica. He was a physician by trade, but he ends up succeeding Isaac Newton as president of the Royal Society. His collections and purchases of other collections, along with his own, found the core of what is now the British Museum. And maybe most important is he isn't alone in inventing it, but he most famously is seen as an inventor of what's called Sloane's chocolate milk, his recipe for taking cacao and making milk chocolate, which is handed down to Cadbury Brothers. And Cadbury chocolate in the 19th century was based on Hans Sloane's recipe for milk chocolate and marketed themselves that way. If you're interested in Sloane, the wonderful book Collecting the World by James Delbourgo, who is a great accounting of his remarkable life. And that collecting that Sloane did in Jamaica is extended to all the globe through the 3 great voyages of the imperial scientific traveler, James Cook. His first voyage, where he headed to the Pacific to observe a transit of Venus, led him to Australia. And on that voyage was Joseph Banks, who becomes Charles Darwin's good friend, as well Daniel Solander, who was Linnaeus's student. They were the two naturalists that Cook took along on his first voyage. On his second voyage, the father, Johann Forster, with his son, George Forster, and they approached near to Antarctica, the nearest voyage coming close to that land, although they didn't land there. On the third voyage, famously, Cook journeys to Alaska and to Hawaii, where he is killed by the islanders, in part for the perception that he was an imperialist and he was there claiming and taking Hawaii from the king of Hawaii. So Cook and his journeys, this model of scientific collecting bound up with colonial expansion. On that first journey, then, this key figure, Joseph Banks, who becomes both a friend to Darwin and to Humboldt himself. Banks, along with his voyage with Cook, did other voyages, one with the Niger to Canada, Newfoundland, and Labrador, explored on that voyage. He then goes with Cook on the journey around the world, and then he does one other voyage to the Orkney Islands, the Hebrides, and Iceland on the Sir Lawrence, 1772. He brings his collections back, and famously, he founds the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, which exist to this day and contain Banks's plants and some plants that Humboldt brought back too. Because that botanical collecting was something that he pushed Humboldt to do, because Humboldt journeys to England and meets Banks, and Banks then becomes a sponsor of sorts for Humboldt for his American expedition, because Humboldt ships many of his specimens to Banks so that they wouldn't be seized by the British, who were then at war with the Spanish. So Banks and Humboldt remain in touch until Banks' death, and he aids Humboldt through his network of scientific contacts, forwarding information to Humboldt, and Humboldt sharing information with Banks. Both of them believing in the cosmopolitan mission of science and the internationalism of science. As well, bound up in Cook's voyages and Humboldt's life are the foresters themselves. The father bringing the son along on that voyage, the second voyage around the world with Cook. And when they return, Johann Forster publishes observations made during a voyage around the world. But his son George publishes the travel account of that. And this is a bestseller, A Voyage Towards the South Pole and Round the World, published in 1777. Both father and son are admitted to the Royal Society, but son being admitted at this early age of 22. You can still find these books being in publication today, and both of them were books that Humboldt read as a young man, and he wanted to be these two. But even more significant, he got to know the son, and this was Humboldt's mentor and exemplar of scientific traveler. He meets George in 1789 when Humboldt studies at the University of Göttingen, where his brother was also living. George takes Humboldt on a voyage, on a journey March to July in 1790 through the Netherlands, along the Rhine, into France, and then to England, where he introduces him to his friend, Joseph Banks. And then Forster publishes an account of that journey he does with Humboldt, Views of the Lower Rhine. And then most significantly, in terms of shaping Humboldt's philosophy, Forster, from early 1793, is actively involved with organizing the Mons Republic. He had been in Paris with the French Revolution, and he follows that revolution onto German soil. The First Republic is located on German soil, was constituted on the principles of democracy as articulated in the French Revolution, but the Republic was quickly defeated in July of 1793, and Forster has to escape back to Paris, where he sadly dies in exile the next year in 1794. Forster famously writes, "All peoples of the earth have equal claims to my goodwill, and my praise and blame are independent of national prejudice." The young Humboldt will adopt that as his philosophy as well, and the belief then in science and liberty being bound together, because international collaboration will transcend all national prejudice. Both Forster and Humboldt deeply believed that. So Humboldt and Forster believed nature was the domain of liberty, scientific collaboration, friendship, mutual support, mentorship. Humboldt learns this at a young age from Forster and carries it through his lifetime. Humboldt believed nature is the domain of liberty, because nature's balance was created by diversity, which might in turn be taken as a blueprint for political and moral truth. Everything from the most unassuming moss or insect to elephants or towering oak trees had its role, and together they made the whole. Humankind was just a small part of nature. Nature itself was a republic of freedom. That's Andrea Wolff from her great biography of Humboldt, published just 5 years ago. But much to Humboldt's frustration, this exploration of the globe was bound up with ecological imperialism. And this new geography of nature that's shaped by Europeans going out and discovering new worlds, sadly was wrapped up, as Jared Diamond famously titles it, Guns, Germs, and Steel. And we need to detail some of that reality of this scientific exploration too. Because ecological imperialism was part of those trade routes that were then established by the scientific explorers, the trade routes that were driven by currents and winds that Dampier and then others documented and mapped. And it was those nations of Europe, Spain, Portugal, England, France, the Netherlands, that pioneered those trade routes and then colonized that world. But they colonized it more than just political entities. They colonized it as ecological entities. And that geography of nature that was shaped by the movement of Europeans across the globe led a University of Texas historian to ask the fateful question, what in heaven's name is the reason that the sun never sets on the empire of the dandelion? And Al Crosby answers that question in his great work, Ecological Imperialism, the Biological Expansion of Europe, 900 to 1900. It was more than just that one book, but the previous work that he did, the Columbian Exchange, Biological and Cultural Consequences of 1492, that grounded this new discipline that Al was part of called environmental history. So these two key works detail that global expansion of the geography of nature that I've been talking about in this lecture. The key moment, of course, was 1492, where Columbus lands in the New World and views it as a New World wilderness. But it wasn't that at all. We've inherited that pristine myth of 1492, where there was a land, a world of barely perceptible human disturbance that the Europeans found. But as a geographer, Bill Denevan, wrote about in 1992, on the 500th anniversary of Columbus's arrival, the myth persists that in 1492 the Americas were a sparsely populated wilderness, a world of barely perceptible human disturbance. There is substantial evidence, however, that the Native American landscape of the early 16th century was a humanized landscape almost everywhere. Populations were large, forest composition had been modified, grasslands had been created, wildlife disrupted, and erosion was severe in places. Earthworks, roads, fields, settlements were ubiquitous. And with Indian depopulation in the wake of Old World disease, the environment recovered in many areas. A good argument can be made that the human presence was less visible in 1750 than it was in 1495. Uniquely, Humboldt shared that same vision, one articulated in 1992. And that too is something we'll unpack in coming lectures through this year, but also significantly, this links Humboldt to geographers that I'm part of as well. Culturally, we still persist in America in believing that this was a sparsely populated wilderness. The concept of wilderness underlies environmentalism in America, and Bill Denovan's important article, the most cited article of the 20th century by an American geographer, sparked what was called the Great New Wilderness Debate, a whole book that puts together the many articles and responses to Denovan's work is Max Oschlager's publication that you can go and find all the details of that debate that sprang up in the 1990s. But it's no debate for geographers or anthropologists or pre-Columbian ecologist. Wilderness and the humanized landscapes of America is a pretty settled understanding within science. The humanized landscapes of 1491 stretched from North America to the Arctic, down through Mesoamerica, through the Caribbean, through South America, to the southern tip of that land. Of course, right, the Andes were terraced by the Incas. The Amazonian basin was shaped by civilizations that had clear-cut and managed those lands as agricultural lands. Ironically, as the clear-cutting of today opens up the Amazon, we're discovering earthworks such as the one in the lower picture here. All of this was detailed in a popular and wonderful account of all this scholarship written by Charles Mann, 1491. I highly recommend it. And in 1491, Mann gives a recounting of all the scholarship that led up to that Columbian exchange. A key moment was the transformation in 950 AD, where the Mayan Empire had cut a large portion of Central America, what now is southern Mexico and the Yucatan, stretching down through Guatemala and Honduras into Nicaragua. What the land looked like then in the lower image, the white being landscape that was stripped of forest. And by cutting down the forest, Mayans changed their local climate and the hydrology, and it forced them to do agriculture on more and more marginal land, and probably led part of the reason for the downfall of the Mayan empire. All of this is detailed in dry and complete scholarly works by geographers, from Bill Denovan's work on the native population of the Americas in 1492 to the three-part look at the landscapes of the Americas, Bill Denovan doing Amazonia and the Andes, Bill Doolittle from UT doing native North America, and Whitmore and Billy Turner doing Middle America before 1492. When Columbus arrived, the best estimate is that the American population was around 54 million people, 8 to 10 million people living in North America. What happened then is what Al Crosby described as the Columbian Exchange. And here's Charles Mann talking about that. Until about 200 million years ago, Eurasia and the Americas were a single landmass called Pangaea. It broke apart, and for millions of years, the parts had little communication. As Crosby put it, Columbus initiated the process of knitting back together the seams of Pangaea. And ever since 1492, the hemispheres have become more and more alike as people mix the world's organisms into a global stew through the Columbian Exchange. And this stew is detailed in Al's book and Charles Mann's 1491 and his follow-up book 1493. This exchange of Europeans bringing to the Americas apples, bananas, cabbages, citrus fruit, lettuce, peaches, watermelons, most importantly, coffee, but rice, wheat, sugarcane. And then from the Americas come turkeys and cacao to make Hans Sloane's chocolate, corn, peanuts, chili peppers. Most significantly for Europe, potatoes, a crop that helped rebuild the European population after the period of the Black Death. And Black Death was one of those things that unfolded in the New World as those Europeans brought back diseases that had been absent from the Americas: smallpox, influenza, typhus, measles, malaria, diphtheria, whooping cough. And the Native Americans had their immune systems had no defenses against those diseases. This led to a reshaping of both the Old World and the New World natural history from 1492 to 1799, when Humboldt takes ship to go and explore the Americas. That exchange both between the New World and the Old, but on a global scale, is what Al Crosby depicts as ecological imperialism. And biologically, ecologically, this kind of change is understood within ecology as something called ecological release. Columbus set off an ecological explosion of a magnitude unseen since the ice ages. Some species were shocked into decline, most prominent among them Homo sapiens, which in the century and a half after Columbus lost a fifth of its number, mainly to disease. Others stumbled into new ecosystems and were transformed into environmental overlords. Picture book illustrations of what scientists call ecological release. That was the dandelion, for instance. Ecological release occurs when a species expands its niche within its own habitat or into a new habitat where there is little competition for resources. This is what gets called invasions or invasive species, but not all released species will become invasive. Most released species that don't immediately die out tend to find a small niche in the local ecosystem. And today, dandelions are in those niches all the way around the globe, where they were introduced by Europeans from Europe. But the greatest impact was that human die-off. From disease, there came depopulation of the Americas in particular, South, Central and North America, as well as the Caribbean, where diseases like smallpox and measles, bubonic plague, influenza, fevers, all swept over and over again through those lands, depopulating that 8 to 10 million people of North America, 54 million of the Americas. This chart depicts just what happened in Florida from 1519 to 1617. In less than 100 years, the depopulation of that land through disease, but also through the genocide inflicted by Europeans on native peoples. Much greater than the deliberate killing was this inadvertent killing through disease, not understood by Europeans, and often predating the arrival of a European to the Mississippi or through to Texas. The diseases preceded the Europeans. So often when Europeans found areas like the Mississippi, what they found were deserted cities like Cahokia, the great settlement of the Mississippian cultures. And their pyramids were just simply considered mounds on the landscape, by then covered with trees and lightly populated. The impact of that loss was the loss of the keystone species that managed that landscape of the Americas, because Native Americans were the keystone species. As Mann recounts, until Columbus, Indians were a keystone species in most of the hemisphere, annually burning undergrowth, clearing and replanting forests, building canals, raising fields, hunting bison, netting salmon, growing maize, manioc, and the Eastern agricultural complex, the bean, corn, squash combination that was invented by the Mississippian cultures. Native Americans had been managing their environment for thousands of years, but all of these efforts required close, continual oversight. In the 16th century, epidemics removed the boss. Not only did invading endive and rats beset them, but native species too burst and blasted, freed from constraints by the disappearance of Native Americans. The books on this slide are just a portion of the extensive scholarship and environmental histories that have been written over the last 40 or so years, depicting the different understanding of Native Americans and debunking the myth like the ecological Indian. All of those you can explore for a much more detailed account, and we'll return to some of those in subsequent lectures this year. But if you just start with Charles Mann or with Al Crosby's books, what you'll see is that depiction from 1492 onward, where Jamestown gets overrun by rats and they bring in clover and bluegrass, where endive and spinach escaped from colonial gardens and grew into impassable 6-foot thickets on the Peruvian coast. Imagine vegans just having to eat their way through that. Mint overwhelming Andean valleys, the pampas of Argentina when Charles Darwin arrives there in 1832. Hundreds of square miles of feral artichoke had strangled that landscape. That's feral artichoke in the picture at the bottom. Darwin found that peachwood from invasive peach trees was the main supply of firewood from Buenos Aires. But in North America, peaches invaded the southeast. When we clear-cut the Appalachians in Georgia, well, in 1700s in Georgia and the Carolinas, it was a wilderness of peach trees. And then famously, rabbits were introduced to Australia by the First Fleet in 1788. And of course, rabbits overran Australia. Ecological imperialism. And that ecological imperialism from 1600 to 1800 followed those global trade routes, infested all those colonial sites, and transformed the landscapes of those new worlds. The things we brought back to Europe transformed that landscape as well. All of this, you can skip the reading and just go by Randy Newman's Songbook Volume 2 or his album Bad Love from 1999 and listen to the song Great Nations of Europe. Randy clearly had read Al Crosby and Charles Mann. The great nations of Europe had gathered on the shore where they conquered what was behind them, and now they wanted more. So they looked to the mighty ocean and took the western sea. Great nations of Europe in the 16th century. Hide your wives and daughters, hide the groceries too. Great nations of Europe coming through. The Grand Canary Islands, first land to which they came, they slaughtered all the canaries there, which gave the land its name. There were natives there called Guanches by the score. Bullets diseased the Portuguese, they weren't there anymore. Columbus sailed for India, found Salvador instead. He shook hands with some Indians, and soon they all were dead. They got TB and typhoid and athlete's foot, diphtheria and the flu. Excuse me, great nations coming through. So that transformation of ecological imperialism predates Humboldt. The transformation of science and scientific travel predates Humboldt. And then it culminates in him in so many interesting ways, because Humboldt's vision of science wasn't about wilderness and untouched landscape. It was his recognition that landscapes had been transformed from humans from the very first human, and his acceptance of that as a fundamental fact of nature, which is what makes him important to us today. Because for Humboldtian, science was a science of dynamic change. His goal was to discern the constancy of phenomena in the midst of apparent changes. One concept that's central to Humboldtian science is that of a general equilibrium of forces amidst change. Not balance and stability, but ordered dynamic change. Today in ecology and environmental science, we call this resilience. Humboldt had discovered resilience 200 years before anyone else. The general equilibrium which reigns amongst disturbances and apparent turmoil is the result of infinite number of mechanical forces and chemical attractions balancing each other out so that the universe persists amidst constant change. For resilience ecology, the question is, how does anything persist? Because change is fundamental. Humboldt too understood that. He argued we need to recognize unity in the vast diversity of phenomena, and by exercise of thought and the combination of observations to discern the constancy of phenomena in the midst of apparent changes. This is why Humboldt is relevant to us today. And this is why Humboldt is such an amazing figure to go back and understand. And this is why Humboldtian science is a model for earth science or environmental science today. We geographers have never forgotten this, but our colleagues at the Academy are learning it and are being amazed by the insights of Humboldt. Explore, collect, measure, connect, and practice cosmopolitan science through international collaboration to understand the Earth. Humboldt's idea of nature, then, an ordered unity, a globally complex system of interconnections, a cosmos open to imagination and wonder, a subject of exacting scientific study, and an object of human mismanagement, all are relevant to us today, and I'll explore all of those in subsequent lectures through this year. First, I have one more introductory lecture to do. The April lecture of Physical Geography and the Science of Nature will step back and look at that Humboldtian science and why Humboldt articulated science in that way, practiced it in that way, and then championed it through his lifetime as the appropriate science of Earth. And then most interestingly, why that was forgotten in the United States. So join me next lecture of Physical Geography and the Science of Nature.